in the first 8 verses of Revelation, you have a kind of Revelation 21, you have a kind of a general theme presented, and that is the descent of the New Jerusalem. It doesn't actually descend, it's actually sent down from God himself. And just like in chapter 21, verse 1, God has created a new heaven and a new earth to displace the damaged one that was destroyed in the final judgment. The next verse 2 says that I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a beautiful bride for her husband. And so we've been introduced to the idea that you have a new heaven and a new earth, and then you also have a new religious center that is the center point for the new Israel, the new people of God. So everything's being made new. In chapter 22, we're going to see you also have a kind of a new Garden of Eden. So what God is doing is he's backing everything up, and in creating again, he is simply re-establishing, but in a perfect form, all that had been lost over time through the course of sin. The new Garden of Eden. The new tree of all nations, the new river of life, the new heavens, the new earth, the new holy city, the new temple of God. In this case, the temple and the city are the same. And so all of these things are going on in chapter 21, verses 1 to 8. So when you get to chapter 21, verse 9, really all the way down through chapter 22, verse 5, that all kind of fits together. And we're going to look at that in 2 segments. But what you basically have here is you take the general idea of what 21, 1 to 8 says, and you expand on it. Okay, the New Jerusalem is coming down. What does it look like? How big is it? How's it constructed? What's it made of? Who lives there? Should it matter? Well, not really. But God, in his infinite wisdom, also knows that to people like us, it does matter. We want to know what's up there. We want to know what color it is. We want to know how big it is. We want to know how tall the walls are. We want to know what the streets are made out of. Why? Because God, again, in his infinite wisdom, knows how attached we are to physical reality. Now, God could have just made a bold, one-verse theological statement that says, now these are all spiritual things, and therefore one must understand that to describe them in physical terms would simply be a pathetic attempt to externalize what is for us an internal reality. And we'd all look at that and say, well, I don't know if I want to go there or not. So God really, in describing heaven, basically pulls out all the stops. He goes through the architectural dictionaries of humanity. He goes through a list of the most splendid and ridiculously expensive and extravagant building materials that can be imagined. He uses measurements that are just bizarre, not to give us a physical description, but to physically impress us with what an unbelievable place it is. Because the numbers here just don't match. If you tried in a technical sense, the walls are 1,500 miles high and the gates are 600 feet high. Now, that's like a mouse hole. That's like a mouse hole in a skyscraper. And the proportions are bizarre. They don't make any sense. And why would you have 12 gates? Why do you need 12 gates? Even Jerusalem only had 5. And one of them wasn't used very much. I mean, how many directions are there? 4. How many gates do you need? There you go. That's all you need. So why 12? So, like everything else in Revelation, let's not over-literalize everything. Numbers have meanings. Colors have meanings. Jewelry has meanings. Precious stones and metals have meanings. So let's look at that as we examine this and see if we can't find some things. By the way, you need to go sometime in your studies this week in the Bible. You need to go to Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48 and read carefully, verse by verse, through that 8-chapter description of the new temple that Ezekiel is shown in a vision from God. And it will blow your mind how similar the language and descriptions are there to the ones that we read here. You measure things, angels are sent to measure everything. Everything's described in terms of jewelry and gold and silver and precious stones. The measurements are ridiculous. The proportions are bizarre. The temple is beautiful beyond description. And in both cases, both in Revelation and in Ezekiel 40 to 48, the key to the whole thing, in the temple in Ezekiel, it becomes the dwelling place of the Shekinah of God, the holy, glorious presence of God. In Revelation, the New Jerusalem becomes the dwelling place of the holy Shekinah, the glorious presence of God. They're just on the same track. It's just that in John, the city and the temple you can't separate them. Because in the Old Testament system, the temple sat within the city, and the only place that God personally lived in was in the temple. And even at that, God only lived in one compartment of the temple. The holy presence of God was limited to the space, the airspace above and surrounded by the holiest of rooms, which was then attached to the holy place, which was then attached to the outer courts, which was then surrounded by the walls of the temple, which was then enveloped by the outer walls of the city. So that God is here. But when you get to heaven in Revelation, God permeates everything. That's why you have no sun and moon. You don't need them. God is ever present, everywhere, to everybody, and He's pure, unadulterated light. And so there is no darkness and light. There's just eternal glowing light because God's just everywhere. And that's where basically, as one writer has said, basically John takes this glorious vision of the temple in Ezekiel and just ramps it up a whole new level. He takes the temple vision and just jacks it up on steroids and runs it out the door and says, yeah, but God doesn't fill the inner sanctuary of the temple. God fills the whole city. Everything in it just glows with the presence of God. So that's what John does. In chapter 21, verse 9, he says, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues. Why does he have to include that? Well, that's a reminder that all that stuff's behind us. I want you to think about that. The reason one of the angels of the plagues is available to give John a tour of the holy city is because he's no longer needed for the plagues. They've already gone down. The judgment's already completed. The unrighteous have already been purged. All that's left are the angels of God and the righteous of all ages. So there's an intention here. But again, John in these last 2 chapters of Revelation, John is very intentional in the way he says things. So one of the 7 angels from the 7 bowls of the 7 last, did you hear that word? Plagues, comes and he says to John, hey, come along and let me show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. I'm going to show you the wife of the Lamb. Why? Well, they're getting ready to enter into their honeymoon period, the bride and the groom, and it's going to be an eternal honeymoon. They'll never be separated again, because you remember at one time the dragon waged war on the woman, tried to destroy her, tried to separate her from the Lamb, and could not do it. Now he's been punished and destroyed and annihilated. He's no longer a factor in the equation, and so the bride and the groom are now free to marry and enjoy the bliss of marriage for all eternity. So again, the language is very deliberate. She's already been called the bride earlier in chapter 21. The angel was mentioned, by the way, this angel of the wrath was mentioned in chapter 17, verses 1 to 3. So in that case, the same angels were involved. They guided John on another vision. By the way, in chapter 17, do you know what the vision was that the angels of judgment showed John? They showed him the worldly city of Babylon and exposed to him the great prostitute, the great whore of history, who had misled mankind and deceived all men. Now, and the contrast is just fabulous here. Now the same angel comes back and says, well, you've seen the nasty girl. Now let me show you the beautiful, pure, holy bride of Jesus. Because the other girl's not around anymore. Remember chapter 18 and 19? Woe is Babylon, gone forever. Wild animals will pick through the bones of her people. The city will disappear from the face of the earth, and dust will blow in her streets. So that city is gone, and there's only one city left standing, and that's this beautiful city of God that comes from where? From heaven, from God itself. So he says, let me show you the bride. So John's seen the prostitute, now he sees the bride. And there are lots of Old Testament passages, by the way, that talk about the bride of Yahweh, the bride of God in the Old Testament. So again, John doesn't have to create new stuff here. This language has been around for a long time. In verse 10 he says, and he carried me away in the Spirit. That's the third time that's mentioned in this book. To be carried away in the Spirit means to be filled with a vision, a divine vision. It's a kind of a hyper-spiritual term for having visions from God. So he's carried away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high. Why a mountain? Because that's where you go to meet God. Where does Moses go to meet God? Where is Jesus transfigured? Where does Jesus preach from? Mountains. Where was he crucified on? Hilltop. See? That's where you go to meet God. You go to meet God in high places. Where did God show his power over the prophets of Baal? On Mount Carmel. So, high places. Why are the pyramids shaped like mountains? Because in a flat land, the only thing you can get that resembles a mountain, which is where you have to go to meet with God, is you have to build a mountain in order to get there. So, this mountain ideology of, that's where God is found. It's just found all over the place. Tower of Babel. Why did they build the Tower of Babel? They wanted to get as high as they could. Why? Because the higher you got, the closer you got to God. The higher your skyscraper stood, the closer you could get to God when you got to the observation deck. And so that was the idea. So here he goes up on this mountain, and notice it's great and high. By the way, Jerusalem. Temple in Jerusalem. High place. Oh, why are temples always called high places? How come every city in the Roman Empire is built around an acropolis? Do you know what the word acropolis means? It means high city. In every major city in the ancient world, the highest hill that city was built around became the place of worship. That's where all the temples were built. It's the acropolis, the high city. And it wasn't really inhabited. The high city is not part of the populated community. The city is populated around the high city. The high city is where the gods live in your town. That's where the temples are. And same is true in Jerusalem. Where do you build the temple? on the highest mountain in that range. So, this is very common, the high mountain. And he shows me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And it shined like the glory of God. And its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It's interesting because jasper's not clear. Jasper's an opaque stone. But I think what he's saying is the glare, the reflection of the glory. What's really shining here? Is the jewel shining, or is the jewel simply reflecting the brilliance? God himself is the one who shines. The glory of God shines with such brilliance that even a flat, opaque stone just glistens in the presence of God. By the way, in the book of Revelation, the most commonly mentioned jewel is jasper. Isn't that interesting? And it's among the dullest of the jewels compared to many of them. So there's an intention there again. The presence of God is so brilliant that even opaque stones just glow with the presence of God. Isn't that a fantastic description? And the city has a high, great wall. And he's gone to a great high mountain to find a city with a great high wall. Do you see how high we're just getting? See how we're pumping the steroids in here? Everything he sees is a little higher than what he just saw. And the thing that comes after that's going to be higher than that. And it just all keeps getting higher and higher. Because you're talking about God. By the way, in Ezekiel 40 verses 1 and 2, guess where the temple vision takes place? Quote, on a very high mountain. So, here we go, describing the city. By the way, you might be interested to know, in the Greek language, in the original language of Revelation, verses 10, 11, just look at those verses real quick in your Bible. 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. 5 verses, right? In Greek, it's all one sentence. If you think it's easy to translate, it's easy for these preachers to get up and talk about how they ought to translate. No, most of them couldn't read the first Greek word he ever saw in his life. I had a guy, I went and heard a guy one Sunday night years ago. He said he was going to preach on the meaning of the word monogenes because it was wrongly translated. Monogenes was wrongly translated. First of all, the Greek word is monogenes. It's not monogenes. So I got up and left. And Marty says, why did you leave? I said, because the guy's a moron. How is this guy going to give me his expert opinion on a Greek word he can't even pronounce? I mean, come on. That was pathetic. That was just pathetic. And of course, most folks don't know the language, so they thought the guy was just a genius. He couldn't even pronounce the word. So, we need to be careful, but translation is a very complex process. You've got 5 verses here that in the original language is all one sentence. Thank goodness the translators have broken it out for us and put it in what I call bite-sized chunks so that we can digest it. So be careful when you hear people making these great pronouncements about translation. It's like Dale was sharing with us the other night. Something from the translation he was working from and talked about, this translation is meaning for meaning instead of word for word, okay? It's the difference between what is called literal translation and dynamic equivalence. And all translations fall somewhere in between those two. Some are way over here, some are way over there. If you do word for word, it's not understandable in English. If you do dynamic equivalence all the way over here, then a lot of times you lose the real meaning. So somewhere in between. The question is, where in between? And who's perfect? And who's got it all right? And so, it's a difficult thing, but it's interesting to me that that's one single extended sentence. Now, The main characteristic of the city of God is that it is filled with the glory of God. The main characteristic of the city of God is not the size of it, or the type of materials it's made out of, or the width and height of its walls, or the arrangement of the buildings. None of that. The important thing John stresses again and again is that the city of God is filled with the very glory of God himself. He brings that up again and again and again. It shone with the glory of God. In verse 12, it had a great high wall with 12 gates. Why 12? Number of perfection. It's the number of perfection. How many tribes? How many apostles? Now we sit and niggle and argue and squeeze out questions about, but does Paul and Barnabas? When the Bible talks about the apostles, they always talk about the 12. They even talked about the 12 when there were 11. If you remember our passage in Acts 1, they talked about the 11 as if they're the 12. Because the number is 12. So you got 12 tribes, you got 12 apostles, and here you got 12 gates. And that's fine. Don't be too literal. It's highly symbolic. 12 gates, and what was at each of the gates? An angel. Why? Now, I'm going to get you to state the obvious, and then I'm going to tell you it's not true. Why would you put an angel at each gate? What would be the purpose of the angel? Protection. From what? From what? What are you going to protect the place from? The bad guys there's no bad guys. They're gone. All of them. You don't have to worry about a new group springing up in place of the old one. There ain't nothing to spring up from. It's gone. So it's interesting that this city, although it is literally described in ancient terms like a physical city, obviously the walls are not needed. They're not designed to protect the people. They're designed to simply encompass the people with the presence of God. The angels are not there to guard the gates. There's nothing to guard them from. They're simply there to express the presence of God to those who enter the city. They are an expression of God's presence. I can't stress that enough. And this was an insight as I studied this passage that just, it just all of a sudden just kind of slaps you in the face. You don't need protection. From what? So obviously the gates and the walls, as magnificent as they are simply there for show. They're simply there to impress you with the fact that it is such a huge and incredible and fabulous and divinely protected place. And so that's what we have going on here. And on the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. Does this passage anticipate the inclusion of faithful Jews along with the righteous of God in the age of the church? And I think the answer here has to be yes. Because at the bottom are 12 foundations, and on them are the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So you've got, and the 12, do they have literally the name? No. The 12 tribes is inclusive of all the faithful of Israel. What does the writer of Hebrews say? The writer of Hebrews says there was no forgiveness until Christ died on the cross, that those that lived righteously before the coming of Christ were simply held in abeyance until the blood was sacrificed. And then God kind of rolled back and picked all of them up, and through the sacrifice of Christ, even they, after the fact, were made righteous by God. So if you put it that way, everybody belongs to the Lamb. Everybody. Abraham is saved by the blood of the Lamb. David, saved by the blood of the Lamb. The prophets, saved by the blood of the Lamb. And somebody says, well, wait a minute, I'm having a problem with the time. Yeah, you do. God doesn't. That's another way in which he's a whole lot bigger than we are. Amen. All of this flows out in an instantaneous moment in the mind of God. You know, the difference between where we are in 3000 BC is like that in the mind of God. A sneeze. Oh, 3000 BC. Oh, 2100. How about that? Oh, 2015. Yeah, that's about an hour ago. You know, it's just God is just not hung up on this kind of stuff. So, the righteous of Israel, the righteous of the church, those that have, the key is, what do you have to do to get to heaven? You have to overcome. In all ages, you have to overcome and be faithful. You do that, you're in. Okay? So that's what they've done. There are 3 gates in the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, 3 on the west. I've seen commentators spill hundreds of pages of it trying to describe why, trying to express why you do it in the order of east, north, south, and west. I don't really care. The point is you got 3 gates on each side. And the idea of that is, why so many gates? Because you want everybody to come in. Open access. You know, the voice of the Spirit says, come. Let he who hears come. Jesus says, go out into the highways and invite everybody. Tell them, come in. Anybody who comes. I'll put the robe on them. I'll clean them up. I'll dress them up. I'll seat them. I'll feed them. All you got to do is get them in the door. And I'm going to put doors all around the house so that anywhere anybody shows up they want in, they get in. Don't you see how much God wants the world to be saved? How important that is to Him. So again, John is not just messing with us here. His language is intentional as he describes this incredible city of God. Let's go to verse 15 and look at this second paragraph. I think we'll have time to get that in. The angel who talked to me had a measuring rod of gold. Well, of course it's gold. You think God's going to give him one made out of plastic?
That's man-made.
Give him one made out of brass? That'd be pretty. Nah. God does it. And again, why is all this stuff gold? Because gold is the highest metallic standard of the age. The stupid rich people of the universe were judged to be stupid rich because they had a lot of gold. And so for the average schmuck like you and me, sitting in the, working on the street, busting his chops, trying to make a living, hand-to-mouth existence. By the way, that was most all the world back then. It's most all the world today. They'd see those guys walking by with the gold, and they would just drool, and they'd think, man, if I just had one piece of that, I'd be the richest man in the world. Who's the richest man in the world? Guy with the most gold. So, this is what's awesome. John takes gold and commonizes it. Gold in heaven, gold is just junk metal. Scrap metal. You make measuring rods out of it. You pave streets with it. It's like, I don't care who the richest man, and have we not seen this economic issue already come up in Revelation? Where the disciples are being oppressed economically, which even intensifies more, if you please, let's be human for a minute, it intensifies even more their jealousy of those that have so much. How does God describe Rome at the end when he condemns her? He talks about her commerce, her trade, her wealth, her luxury, her trying to find the right word. He talks about how, this is a big word, how ostentatious she is. She just flaunts it. That Rome just, the merchants and the governors and the kings. Remember the passages we looked at where they just flaunt their wealth. And when Rome finally is destroyed by God, the only thing the merchants that made them, the only reason they said, oh, I hate to see that happen is because the cash cow was dead. They didn't love Rome. They weren't loyal to Rome. They just wanted more money, and they just hated to see all of that good financial resource material gone. They're going to have to diversify now. It's kind of like if you take out all of the oil money that ISIS is illegally getting, they've got to find another way to get it. They'll kidnap. They'll rob banks. Now the new thing is they're selling antiquities. They dig up precious stuff and they just open the market and sell it. You got to make money. Money's their God. And the point that John makes again and again, Revelation 21 and 22, is money to God is just junk. It's the kind of stuff you bag up in a hefty trash bag and just throw on the heap at the end of the day. God's not impressed by that. If you're impressed by gold, go to heaven. You'll see so much of it, you'll choke to death on it. You'll walk on it. That's the whole point. John is just overstating everything. And he's using the language that common people would just sit and shake their head and say, yeah, man. Oh, yeah. Oh, boy. Yeah, that's great. Because they've never experienced any of this stuff. Most of these precious stones that make up the gates of the city, most average folks didn't even know what they looked like. Unless they saw them on the necklace around the neck of Caesar's wife as she rode through the streets of the city. They get a little glimpse of it. They didn't know what it was, but it sure was pretty. Kind of like Dolly Parton describing, how much she just admired people who just had stuff. Because when she growed up, she didn't have anything, did she? And that's the way most Christians were in the first century. They didn't have anything. And Rome, on the other hand, just flaunted what they had. Bragged about it. So, heaven is the great equalizer. And all the things, it's like the whole nature of the universe is turned on its head because all the stuff that people value the most is meaningless to God. It's just meaningless. So, takes a measuring rod of gold to measure the city, its gates and its walls. And the city was laid out like a square. Now, why would you do that? Why do you need... By the way, the averaging measuring rod was 10 feet 4 inches long. Can you imagine measuring a 1,500 mile long city wall in increments of 10 feet and 4 inches? See, again, what am I suggesting to you? The numbers they're ridiculous. They don't make sense. What's the purpose of the measuring rod? Simply to get you to the measurement. And God never put it in there so that people would say, well, let's see, you have to lay that rod down 86,426 times on each. Who cares? And who's doing the measuring? An angel. They do it fast. They're like good at that stuff. So he measures this city, and it's laid out like a square. Why? Squares are perfectly proportioned. It's one of the perfect forms in nature. It's the square. Equal on all four sides. So what better place for God and His people than... Where would you better put a perfect God and a perfect people than in a perfect city? Laid out like it's supposed to be. And he measured the city with the rod. It's laid out in a square. It's as long as it is wide. And by the way, in a minute you're going to find out it's as tall as it is long as it is wide. It's a cubit-shaped building. And that's to suggest, that, again, that's just overkill. And he measures this thing out, and it's 12,000 stadia in length. 12,000 stadia. How long is the stadia? Well, there's a problem there. In Greece it's 600 feet, in Corinth it's 632 feet, and in some other places it's as much as 670 feet. So now we've got a measurement issue that we have to resolve because we can't go further in Revelation until we get... Hey, one fellow's put it this way. Somewhere, this city, on average, measures somewhere between 1,400 and 1,565 miles square. If you take 12,000 stadia and plug in 600 feet and extrapolate it into feet divided by 5,280, it gives you basically roughly 1,500 miles. Okay? So it's 1,500 miles long, 1,500 miles wide. And then, what's he saying? Measured the wall using human measurement. Did you catch that phrase? What's John telling us? Don't get too hung up on the numbers. Its length and its width and its height were all 1,500 miles. By the way, did you know this? And I do think that number is significant. Do you know what else is 12,000 stadia long? Roman Empire. If you go from the city of Joppa on the Atlantic coast of Spain to the borders of the Euphrates River in the east, it measures roughly 1,500 miles. Roughly 12,000 Roman stadia. Now tell me that's not intentional. What's he saying? God has a city as big as your stinking empire. I'm Caesar. I rule an empire that's 12,000 stadia wide. Yeah, God's got a town up in heaven that big. Except it's not just that wide, it's that long, and it's that tall. So he's got you 3 times beat. I don't think that's accidental. I think this is a very, very intentional number. Although one could argue too, 12,000 is what? 10 times 10 times 10 times 12. 10s and 12s are numbers of perfection. It's just a variation on 144,000, 1,000, 12,000. They're all variations of the same combination of numbers. And again, you get this. The angel measures the wall. And how thick is the wall? 144, 12 times 12. Here we go again. By the way, what a pathetic wall. What a pitiful wall. How wide's the wall? Anybody have a footnote on that?
200 feet.
You've got a stinking 200-foot thick wall to encase a 1,500-mile wide city? That's pretty pitiful. But what's important here? The number 144. And by the way, don't think for a minute that doesn't force the readers in Revelation to jump back in their mind to the passage where how many people are saved? 144,000. See, John's playing with these numbers. He's throwing numbers out. Oh, that one's 12,000. This one's 144. Yeah, it's all, and he's just saying, hey, get the point. It's the best of the best of the best. Times 3. All the time, every day, everywhere. Okay? And the wall was made of jasper, and the city was made of pure gold. Nice. 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 Would you like to have one room in your house made of pure gold? And this is the purest of gold because it says it's pure as glass. It's that 24 karat, perfectly refined gold does look almost crystalline. And you almost never see it because the refinement process is almost impossible. It can be done in scientific labs. And you can't build out of it. But those are not barriers for God. He can refine it to 100% plus 5 and then build cities out of it. Because it's just junk metal. And if it's not gold, he can take some other metal and make it gold. And then refine it to 100% and then build cities out of it. God's stuff is so much better than everybody else's stuff. And the whole point of this passage is when you start placing loyalty on somebody or something, think about this. Who are you putting your loyalties with? Caesar who rides on a gold-plated chariot, or God who builds cities out of the stuff? Cities the size of the empire. Is there really any choice here? And the foundations and the city walls are just, and I think here's the point. We get so hung up on this list. And by the way, this list here, in verse 19, the foundations are built out of what? Jasper, sapphire, agate, emerald, onyx, ruby, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, turquoise, jacinth, and amethyst. That's a pretty impressive list. This is basically just a rich man's shopping list of all the precious, the really good precious jewels that a person could buy if they had the means to do it. This is a shopping list. This is an Amazon wish list of the 12 most valuable and precious and rare jewels available in the ancient Roman Empire. Okay, that's all it means. What does God use this stuff for? Construction. Foundational construction rock. By the way, the largest stones in a city, now think about this city. The largest stones in a city are always laid at the base. In Jerusalem, the Herodian stones that stand at the base, if you go to the Wailing Wall, it's the only remnant that's left of the city of Herod. The stones at the base of the Wailing Wall are about the size of that panel right there. See that big panel right there? Okay, the stones, the ashlar stones that stand side by side on top of each other about 3 layers high at the base of the Temple Mount are about, each one's about that size. Now imagine an emerald that big. That's impressive. That's a nice emerald.
Put that on your hand.
Yeah. Try ringing that one up. You give that to the wife, she'd hate you because she couldn't do anything with it. You know, imagine laying foundation stones. Again, it's bizarre. Decorated with every kind of precious stone. And the 12 gates were made out of pearl. That's not an altogether common thing either. And imagine in a city where the walls are what? How thick? You got 200-foot thick walls with gates built in each of the walls in 12 different places, and the gates are entirely made. How many pearls do you have to fish out of the sea to build one of those? Again, the numbers are just ridiculous. They're bizarre.
The gates would be 500 miles apart.
Yeah, at least. Yeah. And how big, I wonder? You know, we don't really know. We know they're 200 feet thick. Doesn't say how tall and wide they are. Oh, and wait a minute. And each gate was made of what? That's a big oyster. That is a big, big oyster. Woo! Now, I've been to Israel and I've stood in some of the city gates that have been preserved, and they're gigantic. I mean, one of the entrance gates to Jerusalem, you could drive probably 6 cars wide through the gate. Okay? And it's as tall as it is wide. It's 200 feet thick, and that's made out of a single pearl. So somewhere in the universe right now, there are 12 unbelievably gigantic oysters waiting to be plucked and used by God for heaven. Oh, and the great street of the city. The great street would be what? Yeah, that's Main Street. That's the Appian Way in Rome. Every city in ancient Rome had a main street. Had a big central main street. Usually in ancient Rome it was about 60 feet wide, and it was paved, and it had gutters on the sides, and it was lined with columns all the way down the length of the city. So if the city was 2 miles wide, it was lined with columns for 2 miles on both sides. Incredibly impressive. But none of them are paved with gold. This one's paved with gold. Oh, and it's as pure as transparent glass. Again, it's the finest grade of quality refined gold. Paving material. Asphalt. Golden asphalt. Now, are you getting the point? You see the point he's making? I'm sorry?
What is jasper?
What is jasper?
What is that?
Jasper? It's a greenish colored precious stone. It's very opaque. It's very, very solid looking. It's not like a ruby. You know, a ruby kind of has a crystal quality to it that you kind of look through, and quartz and stuff. Jasper is more of a solid stone, a thick stone. You can't hold jasper up to the light and see light refracting through it like you can with, say, a ruby. It's fairly common back then, but the fact that it shines with the glory of God shows that even opaque rocks glow in the presence of God. The point is, everything in this city is immensely distorted by the presence of God. And everything in this city is taken out of its natural context and unnaturally conformed to whatever God wants it to be. See, the same God that created gold can now make gold do whatever he wants it to. The same God that created an oyster that can make a diamond that big can just as easily make an oyster that creates a pearl that's 200 feet around. Because he's God. And that's the point. Now, do we know any more from this than we did before about what heaven looks like? Not really. Not really. All we know is it's really good. If you think it's easy to describe heaven, go visit the Grand Canyon and come home and try to tell your neighbors what it looks like. How wide it is. Try to describe Niagara Falls to your cousin. Try to stand on the cliffs at Big Sur and describe the Pacific Ocean to your next door neighbor who's never seen or been to the beach. How do you describe it? I mean, John is trying to describe something for us here that is altogether beyond our experience. And all he does is just put together a checklist of the most amazing, remarkable, valuable, precious, rare, incredible stuff that he could possibly imagine from all over the world and say, yeah, God makes it out of all that stuff. That's the way he makes it. Kind of, sort of. But I mean, not really, because it's a whole lot better than that stuff. I love this description. I love this description. And we'll see a little more of it as we go on, but I just, if you don't want to go to heaven for any other reason, want to go to heaven because you're just curious as to what it really looks like. It may be worth going to find out what it really looks like, And by the way, the side benefits are fabulous too. So, I like this passage. We'll spend about 3 more lessons on Revelation. We'll spend one more. We'll go from verse 22 through verse 5 of chapter 22, and then we'll look at a couple more passages, because John basically at the end of Revelation does an altar call. He basically has about a 20-verse altar call. And when he says, so y'all just come on down the aisle while together we stand and sing. Because I guess he figures after seeing how good all that is and how bad the other guys are going to get it, if you're not ready to come forward now, you ain't going to ever make it. So he says, the Spirit says come, the Lamb says come, so, y'all need to come on. So it's pretty fabulous stuff.